The Rex workshop, right? All right, sweet. So I'm Ben. I'm from Euro. I'm the community chair of Rex, and
I'm also from the Rex committee.
this is
Professor Jerry Spiegel.
yeah. And we'd like to thank you for showing up. And well, I guess that's about it.
It's my show.
Yeah, it's your show.
Okay. And just so we have about an hour and a half. Is
Yeah,
that correct? Okay. Super. Good.
Okay.
Thanks to Rex and the club and for you guys. I kind of wasn't really aware of of this activity and this organization. And my name's Jerry Spiegel. I'm a professor in the School of Population and Public Health, and I'm also appointed to the Lulu Institute for Global Issues. And our program actually is only starting to develop courses for undergraduate students for a whole host of issues. The School of Population and Public Health kind of lives within the Faculty of Medicine, but comes from a history where it's really only been doing graduate programs that involve with graduate students. And that's really unfortunate for the university, because the real gap has been kind of the focus on public and more importantly population health, which is such an interesting mix of disciplines. And you can hear me okay in the back? Yeah, okay. Because we haven't had a smattering of courses that could orient undergraduates with very interdisciplinary subjects that have strong methodological cores. So that's been a real gap, and I've worked over the years. I've been at UBC for about 15 years, and working with undergraduates who generally come to me because my focus is really global health. You can see from here that I'm the co-director of something called the Global Health Research Program, and we're affiliated with we're a collaborating center of the World Health Organization. We focus largely on environmental and occupational health issues, because that's really the focus, but it's very much on population health, which has this interdisciplinarity to it, but a real methodological rigor. And I understand that the focus of the club and of this session is on research for the club and your interest in it, which is great, but also research methods is kind of the focus of what I've been asked to talk about today. So what I've set as kind of learning objectives I'm going to talk about here, and it's really to become familiar with a few things. One, there's a range of research methods. How many people have been involved before kind of this kind of activity here with research activities? Just raise a hand to give me an idea of where you're coming from. People have been involved, so not very many, but if you're here, you obviously have some interest, and as you're kind of looking at perhaps your academic careers and future careers, have an interest in knowing more about this. So I'm going to introduce you to a range of methods and designs that can be applied. And then want to introduce questions for you to consider when reviewing kind of research articles, because that's, how many of you have been reading research articles, say, this year? Okay. And when you kind of look at research articles the same way when you look at everything that's available on the World Wide Web, there's a lot of stuff out there, but the real challenge is how do you separate what's credible from what is not credible, or at least less credible. So that means developing some other skills. So I'm going to introduce you to some questions and also refer you to some resources. I'm going to want you to think about some of the biases that could be introduced just by how you approach a research question, and including the language that you use. And we can go into some detail if we have time towards the end. And then finally, I want to introduce you to some principles and some resources that you should consider when you undertake research. And you have a copy of a document here that I'll talk more about later, but while it's focused on global health research, which, as I've explained to you, is the area that I'm kind of most closely involved in, it really applies to kind of ethical pursuit of research across disciplines. Maybe some of the elements that are emphasized here would apply less to someone who is involved in kind of very valuable and interesting laboratory research in pure science. But when you start to think about how that knowledge gets disseminated and used, a lot of these principles will still have value. If you're in a more interdisciplinary and interactive field, a lot of them will very literally apply. And we'll talk about that at the end. Okay, so this is kind of just a roadmap of where I'm going to want to go. To really pick up on what I understand was your first session and kind of set the scene, reflect on where research methods fit. Because if research methods just existed for their own right, it wouldn't be particularly interesting or valuable. So kind of want you to think about the focuses and the questions that you might have, and that I understand you were starting to deal with for those of you who were in the first session. Then want to kind of get to the guts of what's a suite of research methods, designs, and techniques. And that'll be kind of introducing some new concepts for most of you. Will be kind of coming back to things that you've already encountered if you have some background or some experience in research, but probably not the full suite. Then want to consider some examples that we'll go over, and then have some smaller group interaction. Given it the layout, we'll maybe have buzz groups, kind of where you could work things through. And when we get to that, I'll explain it further. From that, we'll come back and look at a discussion of challenges and strategies that you encounter when you're doing research. And at that point, I'll try to pick up on what discussion we have, but also share with you some of the lessons and insights from the research that I and my team are kind of involved with, to share some of those things with you. And then finally, to come back to some principles and resources, including a course that will be introduced for the first time based in the School of Population and Public Health on research methods that's geared for undergraduates. And that's going to be offered at this point, probably the beginning of the summer term. There's a remote chance there'll be an offering. It's distributed learning, so it's distance ed with modules. But for those of you who are interested in pursuing it, it may be quite timely for you to consider. Odds of that happening randomly. And with that, you'd be able to say, no, we assume that the increased risk was really this. This is not randomly distributed. And so the idea of case control is a research design in relation to a certain question. And then another term is a historical prospective cohort. You know what a cohort is? A cohort is really a group of people. So I'm going to break down kind of this language. So a cohort is a group of people. Then historical means you're looking back in time. And prospective means you're looking forward. So what that means is, say, 50 years from now, we wanted to say, unbeknownst to us, there's some very toxic exposure that we're all being exposed to right now, and we don't realize it. So we want to say, gee, what happened to people who had that exposure? So we would reconstitute the group, and then we would investigate, well, what happened to them? Then we would go forward. So we would start, or we could actually start now, and we could say, well, let's track what happens to everybody, because we want to see what the effect is. So we have this natural experiment, then we have this exposure, and this is a term that we were looking at in the case of the Bhopal accident. How do we constitute what the population was, and how do we then go forward to see what happened to them? So these are kinds of quantitative studies. Now we could visualize, as I was saying, this example. So if we take the time period where you have a gas exposure, but you don't have to think of gas, think of any circumstance that could affect your health. You could look kind of at this point in time. And that would be a descriptive study. We would want to say, well, what were the circumstances that you were experiencing prior, at the time of, but really with a narrower time focus. So that would appropriately be kind of, if we looked immediately afterward, what was the view of the symptoms and the effects that were felt? If we wanted to then look analytically, we could then say, but let's, we're talking about a particular kind of health effect that occurred here, but say we're talking about something like colds, like respiratory disease that has a prevalence, but maybe it's a much sharper prevalence in certain circumstances. So you'd want to be looking at, well, what occurs in the community of interest versus a comparison community, in which case it would be an analytical cross-sectional study. You'd be looking at one area versus another. So this is an idea of how you would change your focus. If you looked over time and compared it, you could look, and then those words that I was saying before, a case control or a cohort study. If we were looking at some rare cases, now we would probably look at a case control design. So let's isolate the people who have this rare disease and work backwards. If it's a more prevalent set of conditions, we could look at a cohort study, or let's look at what happened from this cohort versus this cohort. How many people died before age 55 or had a premature death, like in these two communities? So then we could start to say, no, this was an effect. If we wanted to look at an intervention, and whether we're looking at, I use the example of having drug treatment, but it could be some other kind of an intervention. Perhaps it's a kind of a policy intervention in the world of health, having access to health services. Perhaps it's something totally different. Perhaps we can visualize the idea of an intervention in terms of purely economic terms. We can think of an intervention in purely biophysical terms. But how do changes get produced in animal populations, whatever? But you're looking then, when you have an intervention, you say, well, does that make a difference? So then you're looking at these circumstances, and you're typically looking at 2 points, a before, a pre, and a post intervention period. And that's another type of study. And when you do that, you're also looking at, are you introducing that change? Are the populations the same or different? Is that going to be responsible for what the change is? So these are things for you to consider. When you're talking about human health, if you don't consider that, you could be kidding yourself, because it may be that other circumstances were also producing that change when you think you're focusing in on a certain intervention. So, kind of in the case that I talked about, we're looking at the idea of exposed and unexposed. So we don't have to go any further than that. So I'm going to ask you guys some questions here to see if you have any ideas, given the language. And I realize for a lot of you, this language is new. But if the rate of cancer is increased in a community due to a specific exposure, so here you have no idea what the rates are, but you want to see if kind of rates where there's been this exposure have been different. What kind of study do you think you'd want to do?
Analytical.
Okay, it'll be analytical. You're going to be comparing things. Let's go a little further to say what kind of analytical study would it be? Yeah, so it would be a cohort. And if we looked at that, it would probably be a powerful design, would be a historical prospective cohort study. What does that mean? Is you'd be trying to look at what the group of people was at a certain point in time, and then follow them forward. So that was good. So if a rare cancer has been noted in the community, and to want to see if it's related to an exposure, what kind of study do you think that would be?
Case study.
Yeah, a case control study, excellent. That's good to know that people were paying attention. But that's good, because you're not only, you're getting new vocabulary, and you're really trying to say, how does it relate to a real circumstance? If a certain treatment or community health program is effective, what kind of a study would that be? Well, an ecological study would give you kind of a picture of what is taking place. So that's one dimension of it, is you're looking at the presence of something in an area. But if you want to zero in on comparing it from one to another community, what kind of a study would we call that? Well, it's ecological. In this case, we would be looking like a little more rigorously and looking at because of how it was defined, pre and post intervention. So we're saying there was an intervention that you're trying to say, like in terms of a treatment or a community health program, there's a kind of an intervention. And then if you wanted to see if it made a difference, ecologically, you'd be looking at a community. So your unit of analysis is the community, but you'd want to look at it in comparison to an area that doesn't have that intervention or treatment. So we typically, the jargon is pre versus post intervention study with concurrent control group. If one type, and this was very much from that setting in India, where there were different approaches to medicine. Some of them are allopathic or are Western, and some are Ayurvedic, which is more a traditional Indian approach to medicine. And they each have kind of advantages. So if you wanted to say, well, what's more appropriate, what would be the strongest design study that you could think of pursuing? And this is a bit of a novel conception, but think of the randomized control trial. We were kind of discussing a way of pursuing that, and they did it on a bit of a minor scale, but we normally think of a randomized control trial when it's kind of simply, this, you have a pill, you have a placebo. Nobody knows. Well, the randomization that we had discussed with the clinic in Bhopal, India, was for certain individuals where there was an equal acceptance in the community of Ayurvedic and allopathic treatments, whether they would randomly be assigned. Now, if you did that here, where there isn't that acceptance to kind of an Ayurvedic treatment, I don't think you'd get through your ethics control, your ethics review board, because people would not have kind of like an equal faith. But in the circumstances present in Bhopal, India, this was an interesting design. That way, you could then say, well, you know that the people who came in with these concerns, similar concerns present in the two groups, the ones who went through an Ayurvedic treatment group actually did better. Now, if you didn't have that design, what's to say that, well, you know, the people who were really seriously ill, they went to the allopathic group. And the people who had kind of minor symptoms, they went to the Ayurvedic. So, of course, the people in the Ayurvedic group ended up doing better because they weren't as sick. If you had a randomized controlled trial, or you would take care of that suspicion. Now, there are many other things to consider, but the idea here is the idea is you want to guard against the biases. And bias in a statistical sense. How many people have come across the term at this point, bias, in relation to statistics? Okay. Because bias is one of those words that because it has a meaning every day, people get especially one that challenges someone's neutrality, they get emotional instead of understanding that in a statistical or a scientific sense, bias doesn't mean anything about your values. It means that you're going to be slanted towards seeing things in a certain way, regardless of what your will is. And in this case, we have to, and always in research, we have to guard against biases that are being introduced by how the world is being represented. So this is why this is an interesting exercise to consider how certain designs will be able to pick up. Like, I'll give you an example too, because we're not talking about power, but if we all know now in 2015 that there's a strong relationship between smoking and lung cancer. I'll pick on that case because it's an easy one to discuss. What would happen if you did a study, say in 1950, and you had 100 smokers and 100 non-smokers? What do you think you would find? Would you find a difference? Short answer is probably not, for two reasons. One, well, we mentioned the chronicity, like the latency of a disease. So if you don't look at the latency period, you're going to miss that. But also, depending on the prevalence, how common something is, if your numbers aren't big enough, you're incapable of picking up something that actually may be very present. If we would have had 3,000 people, maybe we would have picked that. Well, we certainly would have picked that up. So there's lots of things that can introduce bias in your design. Okay, let's look at a couple more. How common a certain health problem is in a community. What kind of study? And it'll say that, think about, this is a case where cross-sectional would be an appropriate study where you're looking at two different communities at one point in time. So you're saying, what's it here, what's it there? So it's not a very powerful analytical design, but for this question it would be appropriate. And then finally, have this question: what are the barriers to improving the health of a group of people in a certain neighborhood, how they feel about the issues, and what could be done about this? What kind of research would give you insight to something like that? Well, in a case like that, what I would argue is that a qualitative design. People familiar with the term qualitative research? Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about what qualitative research is. And let's just look at the bottom set in terms of the ways that you observe it. when you kind of are looking at quantitative research, you're collecting data where you already have a pretty good idea of what it is you're looking for. You may be misleading yourself. So you're still, when I said how much of it, you're still making some assumptions about that there's a certain parameter that's important, and you're looking at measurements. But in this case, you're observing, but you're not jumping to any conclusions that you can systematically measure something, because maybe you're wanting to question what it is you're observing. You could have interviews, and you could be very open to hearing what is being reported in relation to a concern. You could have participant observation. You could be taking part in a group dynamic and seeing like what's actually taking place. You could be looking at focus groups where you get people together to discuss these issues and you have that interaction. So that may be something that informs you as to what it is that you're doing. So these are different ways that you could be looking at interviews. When we're talking about quantitative data, there's lots of ways that you could obtain that. You could have surveys with very structured questions that you can give. I could hand out, when you do a course evaluation form, what would you call that, a quantitative or a qualitative exercise at UBC? How course evaluations are conducted? Now, that would largely be quantitative because of how it's conducted. If the process was such to say, you know, what did you like about this course? Open-ended question, that would be qualitative. And there are some parts of that that are open-ended, but generally the power of it and how it's used is quantitative. Rate on a scale of 1 to 7. Very interesting, not at all interesting. So that's a dimension that gives you quantity. But there's also the dimension where it's asking you, well, what did you think about this? What did you like? What didn't you like? So there's a bit of a mix. So that's an example. Typically, for quantitative data, we look at economic data that's collected. So that's a quantitative sets of data. When we look at patient records and kind of there's observation and measurement, that gives us the basis for quantitative measurement. And sometimes even if you have a description, you translate that into a number, very ill or a grade, that permits you to do a quantitative analysis. Lung cancer, yes. Young lung cancer, no. Body mass index, here. When we have a lot of concern towards obesity, we look at a measure like body mass index. Some people contest that body mass index is the right measure. Well, then you start to blow out of the water the idea of what you're building your whole quantitative analysis around. So there's always a relationship between the quantitative measurement and what it is being signified. But once you accept what the parameter is, that gives you a way of analyzing its presence. For the interviews, now we're talking in a qualitative sense, we could look at an informal way that, say you do an interview with someone, and then you're just recording it. So this is kind of you didn't really set this up to be a structured interview. It happened and you're trying to recollect what you learned. In an unstructured interview, we maybe have a lot of open-ended questions. So it's like this course evaluation where we say, what did you like about the course? Did you feel that it met your needs? And you ask a number of questions. Like, that could be kind of an unstructured, because maybe it's something that is just coming out of an informal discussion. If in fact we had a guide that said, these are my questions, that wouldn't really be unstructured. It would be unstructured. Perhaps we had kind of it was more a question about your experience in university, and we could piece together some of your attitudes towards a particular course. So we could say, well, that was really unstructured in relation to that. Semi-structured means you have a guide, but you don't have very specifically structured questions. So there's a variety. Key informants typically means you're going to people because of their special knowledge. When we have a focus group, we typically group people together who have particular experiences in common. We want to see the interaction, and that could create an environment for more interactions. So this is an idea of how we go to compare kind of the different methods that we have. And then there's techniques. I was talking about some of the particular areas. You could look at, this is from a book called Research Methodology that's widely cited, but there's lots of resources for you to go to when you get to that stage to look for research methods. And they will kind of introduce the kinds of techniques and experiences that you could go to and use what you started to learn last time, acquainting you with the library resources. There's a wealth of information that's been collected. You could also look at the controversies and the debates, what's strong, what's weak. Some of the ideas I was introducing to you before really talk about strengths and weaknesses. Ultimately, as you develop your training, you have to make those decisions, because a lot of the art of what you guys have to do, particularly as you get kind of more further along in your background, is to distinguish between what's good and what's questionable. So there's a lot of resources for you to go through. We're not going to go through that, but I'm just going to point one thing out. Like typically, if you start to build a questionnaire, there's places where yes, no questions are appropriate, but often if you just go, the reason why your course evaluations have what's called a Likert scale, because Likert was the guy who was the name of the person who actually developed that technique and analyzed it. But it's like when you have this, then if you answered yes, no, it's not very sensitive to what differences are, so you're not going to develop a lot of insights. So if you have a scale, it's one technique to allow you to differentiate a little more. But again, without the qualitative side to it, you still may be very limited in how you can interpret it. And without analyzing it, you might find that some people always say strongly disagree, and other people, and it may even be cultural influences that you can look at. But that being said, it gives you more sensitivity. So these are, I just picked on one because you could look at any of these and you could think of equivalent techniques. As you zero in on a question of interest, you can start to see, okay, well, what techniques are powerful ways to actually conduct observation. Then, when the reason why you're collecting all that data is then you can analyze it. So the key thing, and I remember when we were doing a big set of analyses in Cuba, which is a fascinating country to work in now, and we were kind of looking at the way the community was adapting to very difficult changes that came when they were kind of experiencing a huge economic downturn in the 1990s, and they were trying to work to improve life in a community. So we had a set of questions that our Cuban colleagues had done when they were looking at a risk perception study, but we were now trying to look at not just how risks were seen differently, but how life was proceeding with these difficult circumstances, and as a result of the changes that had been taking place in the community. And just before we started to do this work, we reviewed it. We said, we can get good information on all of these things, But if you think back to what it is we're really trying to study now, we're not really asking good questions about that. So in the last minute, or in the last phase, we introduced about 15 kind of new questions that ended up being the questions that most of our analysis, and we actually developed a lot of papers, and it had helped to influence some policy and decisions. But a lot of those questions came because when we looked and we said, are we really looking at the right variables in relation to our question? So when you think about it, you have to be thinking about this. And then the idea of a dummy table that I put here is before you even start the research, you should be thinking of, well, if you're successful enough to actually get useful information, how would you work with it? So the idea of a table is to say, well, this maybe can tell me how many people have this condition, maybe in relation to a certain exposure. If I get these answers, will it allow me to fill that in? And if the answer is yes, you know you're on the right track. Just looking at qualitative and quantitative, and then maybe we could have a little bit of a discussion. That typically when you're talking about qualitative approaches, you're trying to understand and interpret social interactions. So that's typically something that you're trying to piece together an understanding of what the it is. Quantitative, you're taking some framing that you have about what's important, and you're trying to say, well, what are the relationships? That can test a hypothesis, it could look at cause-effect, it could look at effects at a broader population level, not just what could anecdotally happen, but what tends to happen in a certain setting, and you could make predictions. So these are two different orientations and strengths, and there's a bit of a relationship. We could look, more specifically at different dimensions, and again, you could look, if you're interested in it, at one of these resources to say, well, okay, what are the specific strengths? But for example, the generalizability will tend to be stronger from a quantitative design, remembering, or making sure that in fact, it's not biased. The contextualization will likely be stronger in a qualitative design because you're trying to understand that complexity more. So one could look at these different dimensions, and then we could also look at what it means about you, the researcher. And one thing that you always have to look at is your positionality. Like, where do you fit into this? And sometimes when you come in, it introduces lots of ethical concerns. It also introduces potential sources of bias. If you ask certain questions, it may kind of bias someone to give you an answer that they think you want to hear. So maybe that's not on a very sensitive question. That's maybe not a very good design. So you have to think about that. But you have the idea that in a quantitative perspective, that there's something that you can objectively observe impassionately. From a qualitative, you're saying, well, there's something about the interpretation and the involvement that you have to take into consideration. It'll give you insights, but it may also be a source of bias. So you're thinking about these a bit differently. But I like to use this yin and yang kind of relationship for you to think of is, regardless, your research question, the same way we went through those exercises, is going to guide the choice. Okay? So if you wanted to have a real understanding of a circumstance and what might be important, perhaps a qualitative design is going to be appropriate. On the other hand, if you have a pretty good idea and you're narrowly focusing it in, you may want to look at a quantitative design, and you may actually be able to really control things and have in a laboratory or even in a social experiment, create circumstances and observe behaviors. That could be very insightful. But again, that's a narrow framing. It's not a real world framing. And you could then do a quantitative analysis. So the choice of your methods is going to be situational, but both, we should really think of these as complementary, and that each requires resources and time. And there's ways of accelerating that as well. Now, an area that receives increased attention for, especially as we start to look at real world applications and complexities, is mixed methods, and how you apply the strengths of each and how you sequence that. So for example, at an early stage, if you have qualitative focus, you can zero in on things that are important. And that can influence what it is you will actually take, is how you'll frame your research question for a quantitative analysis. On the other hand, if you have certain observations quantitatively, again, the significance of that and what it means, you could learn more about that through qualitative methods. You say, well, what are these implications? So these are things that, how many people right now are involved in a research project? Okay. Let's think about this with your research question. If anybody wants to talk about their project, this is where I thought we could go into small groups, but for reasons of time and the setup, let's just stay together and maybe spend a few minutes. If someone wants to kind of volunteer an idea of what their research question is and what methods they think kind of might be kind of appropriate. And there isn't a right or wrong answer, in the sense that different methods will give you different perspectives on the particular issue, which would more correspond to what it is you want to pursue. Or it may be that your interest is really in the method itself. You're looking for a setting where you can actually hone your skills, particularly like when you're in a learning phase as the emphasis. So we're always in the learning phase, so we're always paying attention to what methods we could refine through the work that we're doing. But especially when you're choosing careers and areas of focus, it's a good idea to get exposed and experience. So you could actually be led even less by the problem and more by the method, and that makes total sense. But if anybody who can raise their hand that they're kind of involved in a research project, does anybody want to volunteer and say, well, how would you approach not just the what you're looking at, but how you're about to look at it? Any volunteers? Any brave soul?
Our research has just started, and we focused on how different plantations, especially the grass and the mosses, affect the concentration of the carbon dioxide and the methane concentration in a certain area.
Okay, excellent. So if you take that, what is it how would you characterize the approach that you take?
We set up some collars or tubes, and every 2 weeks we measure the tubes once with the syringe to see the concentration of the gases. We just take the gas and bring them to the lab to analyze the components.
Okay. So you have, and this is in a laboratory setting?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, so it's a controlled setting. And in that sense, this would be like more kind of a fundamental, pure kind of knowledge thing, because you're trying to see in a controlled setting what we could expect. And what are the measurements that you're taking?
We are actually doing we compare to 3 groups. One group is 5 colors with only mosses, and one group is 4 colors with only grass, and the last group is 5 colors with a mixture of mosses and grass.
Okay, great. So you're defining the different settings, you're comparing them, and then the measurement you're saying is looking at methane. And so you're going to be taking certain parameters. So you can kind of see that this has a very well-defined structure. approaches. You're not dealing with human subjects. You have, so typically the qualitative methods are important to consider when you're dealing with human subjects. But the research and design concerns are general. If you got to the stage where you had kind of some findings that started to look at some differences and we're looking at introducing that into communities farther down the road, then you may want to start to be considering some of those human interaction qualitative sides. But right now, this is a very good example of how you have a protocol that looks at research design. Is anybody dealing with a case where you're dealing with human subjects?
My research question is how the different types of progesterone affect the incidence of breast cancer. Yeah, and we just look at the medical data. That's all.
And what's the population that you're looking at?
Because it's a really, we just started, so we just look at that hospital. That's all.
Okay. Well, what designs could, and depending on what the specific question is, will lead us to the answer. But given that we're looking at predictors of breast cancer, what would be some designs that could be of interest, whether it's going to be appropriate for this particular study or not? I'm asking the question, what design could be? You could take
A historical perspective, like going back and seeing like if there was more post-war effects.
well, you could kind of look at that, but if you looked at a case control, if we say the cases now, because although breast cancer is still far too common, it still could be looked at in an overall population as a relatively kind of rare circumstance depending on the age group.
How we look at the hormone treatment?
Okay. Yeah, no, so that's even better. So if you're looking at the hormone treatment, then you're probably looking at a pre and post intervention trial, like where you're kind of looking at a population that's subjected to this treatment, and you may want to compare it to a population that isn't undergoing that treatment to see what the consequences are. Okay, so what I suggest is when you look at this, and we have 10 minutes left, so I just want to kind of jump ahead to acquaint you with some other kind of resources, in the last 10 minutes. But these are questions that I suggest you may want to look at when you get to the stage, because remember when we, in Ecuador, we're initiating kind of a new master's program, and the word for what in Spanish is que, and all the students were very strong in terms of when they had to do thesis. So that's like a major research project that they're doing. But it was typically the que was strong, but the como, or how, was always something that was weaker, in the sense that you were focusing on what the problem was, especially if that was what you were doing as your project, and how you understood it. But how you did it, the devil's in the detail. And, at first you said, well, I'm going to use qualitative and quantitative methods. Well, that gives you an orientation. But you have to say what specifically you're going to do in the design. So that's typical when we start to do a project, is we're challenging ourselves to look at that. But what I suggest that, that these are kinds of questions that as you start to undertake some research, you think about. So that's something you could go away with. I want to acquaint you with a few resources before we leave. One is, you said the majority of hands went up when the question I'd asked was, are you looking at research papers? And again, there's research papers that are strong, and there's ones that are weak. And there's been lots of scandals recently about even peer review. And the key thing in science and publications is peer review, which is the idea that you have a test of people who are recognized as with expertise in the field, and they review the paper before it's published. And there's been, even where there's peer review, from some very prestigious journals, incidents of scandals, like where that wasn't respected, with kind of paid open access publications, which are great for giving you open access and broadening it. But what it does do is open the field for, it's my business, I'm gonna give you a place to publish if you give me a few $1,000s. And well, does that mean that this is really just something that's a way for a publisher to make thousands of dollars per paper, for someone to kind of pad their resume by saying I have a publication? But there isn't the quality control that's supposed to be there for peer review. So these are all the more reasons that you have to develop skills. Maybe it's a paper that was published in a prestigious journal that has good quality control, so I can trust it even though I don't really know this area. But there's a very nice paper that I like to refer to that's called Assessing the Methodological Quality of Published Papers. And there's other sources. This is a book that's based on it. And they ask questions like this, and then they give you some orientation and guidance. So as you develop, if you're going to be doing work, and I'm asking the club to put a few kind of links on the, I think the club will put up those links. So one of the links they'll have is a link where you can get this paper. But it basically asks these questions. Was the study original? Whom is the study about? Was the design of the study sensible? Was systematic bias avoided or minimized? Was assessment blind? Were preliminary statistical questions dealt with? What are the ethics, the implications, and the discussion of this? So these are things, and when you look into different disciplines, there's going to be different parameters that will dictate, what excellent research looks like. So in the cases that were given from you, if you look in those particular disciplines, I've been biasing this towards public health, population health, because it's the area I'm most familiar with. But there's going to be different resources in different disciplinary areas. So acquaint yourself with that so you're armed with the skills that you need. There's questions that you could look at for how you critically apply research methods. And I'm also going to have a reference to a paper that we did where we were critically examining the limitations of different approaches to research, and we were actually looking cross-culturally at approaches towards population health that are more prominent in the South, in the global South, in Latin America, that even look, it's a big advance to say, well, we don't only look at health for treatment, but we look at determinants of what influences health. And our Latin American colleagues were saying it's even more than looking at the determinants. You have to look at the processes that are affecting health. So if we're looking at nutrition, it's not enough to say, well, what are the factors that affect poor nutrition, to think narrowly at an intervention in one area, but maybe look at the grouping of processes that are involved, which could lead us to different strategies for how to intervene. I'm not going to go through any of that now, but there'll be a reference to that paper, because what we had done was, I'm just going to go quickly into one example of saying that this is, we can look at what are the factors that affect health, not only at how a treatment can affect health, but what are the factors, and those are called determinants of disease. And we could look at different scales. But at what point do we intervene? Over here, do we look at the factors that even influence, for example, with a concept like food security? With food security that's there, maybe we have to look at the factors that affect food security in a population, and we have to look at the rights of people to how they approach food, how they grow it. So this is our research program right now, is looking at a variety of studies where we're looking at how this question is understood. If we look at what are different production options for how people grow food, do they use it with agroecological methods? Do they use heavy applications of pesticide? What are the effects on the workers, on local communities? Looking at questions like that. So it basically sets up the kinds of questions that you investigate. I'm not going to go through that at all now, but there's going to be a paper that will acquaint you with that in 5 areas that our team has experienced with. And in a sense, we're talking about how you could take mixed methodological approaches. I think that goes beyond where we are right now, but if you're interested, you could look at that paper that will be on the site. And then finally, I'm going to get to 3 sets of resources that are available. One is here's principles for good, ethical, and powerful research that were in the handout that you have. And that's an organization called the Canadian Coalition for Global Health Research. If people develop interest in this area, I suggest that you look at that. But it looks at dimensions like partnership, inclusion, shared benefits, commitment to the future, responsiveness to causes of inequities, and humility. Dimensions that when we start to develop technical excellence, we still have to look in the social domains where this research applies. So I strongly recommend that you don't blind yourself to that. But that doesn't mean that you forget the technical excellence too. You need the technical excellence. If you're not providing technical excellence, it's not ethical in the sense that you're not really providing anything to anybody. So you need the technical excellence, but it would be a case of something that would maybe be necessary but not sufficient to have the impact we want to achieve. So from that perspective, you could look at these principles. You could look at a lot of materials that go through this, and there's an interesting area called Supercourse, and again, there's probably, I'm certain that there are similar resources in other disciplinary domains. Because I'm familiar with global health and population health, I take this as an example, but if you go there, you'll get lots of resource material, including PowerPoint presentations with narratives that will acquaint you to different areas. So that's an idea, particularly the methodologies that you involve in the research methods. And then my final slide here is there's a new course that I mentioned at the beginning. And if anybody is interested in that, you can come and talk to me at the very end. But it's only being offered for the first time, and it's been designed for undergraduates through distributed learning. It's called Distributed Health Research Method. It's called Health Research Methods. And this is the, these are the modules that you can see, and PICO, which isn't really part of my regular vocabulary, but the concepts are, was looking at patients, population, and problems, interventions, comparison, and outcomes. And that's really a lot of the setting, the research setting that I was describing to you. So if you're interested in particularly in a health research domain, this may be of interest to you. So if you want to go to the SPPH website, and if you want to acquire any more, come and talk to me at the end of the session. It's So to finish up, I just basically said when we look at this question of research methods, there's whole challenges and wrong turns that you can take. But, you know, there's ways of you developing stronger methods and appropriate methods and excellence. So you have to look at that. But you also have to say, you know, what is a method that's appropriate can't just be decided by looking at methods. You have to look at what the question is, and you have to look at what it is that you're then going to try to be able to do. Maybe the kind of work that you want to do in relation to the question isn't feasible. So you should really think about what is feasible. Maybe you're really interested in a certain kind of method, but it's not going to lend itself to the results that you're going to be able to summarize. So you have to rethink, because you can't just look at this in isolation from everything else. So again, if you want to explore everything further, there's a course, and otherwise I think it's good that you continue with this community, and I'll be around if people have some particular questions, because I know we're at 6:30, and that's I think when all of you, including myself, are thinking we're ending the session. So thanks for your attention, and good luck in your endeavors.